I'm Michael Brown, president of SAR. You probably know that. Ilan Stavans was born in Mexico City and emigrated to the United States in 1985. He studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary, received his PhD from Columbia University in Nueva York. He's currently the Lewis-Sebring Professor of Humanities in Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College in Massachusetts. He's written so many books, I'm not even going to try and list them. Enough so that I wonder if the man ever sleeps. So he seems to be in pretty good shape, so I don't know how he does it. The spectrum of subjects about which he writes ranges from Jewish culture in Latin America to the great writers of Spanish language literature, including Borges, Cortázar, Neruda, and on to Latino pop culture. He's also served as a general editor of the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature, which you can imagine is a huge project. In this part of the world, he may be best known for his advocacy, or at least his interest in Spanglish, about which he's written a great deal and is likely to mention tonight. By the way, we have a limited number of two of his books. The first, Spanglish, The Making of a New American Language, we have available. Actually, will somebody raise, do we have it in the back? It's in the back of the room, which are available at our cost. And also the most recent book, which he'll be talking about, I'm sure, in his lecture, The People's Tongue, Americans and the English Language. The title of his talk today is The People's Tongue, Language in a Divided America. Please join me in giving a warm Santa Fe bienvenido to Ilan Stavans.
Thank you, Michael. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias por esa introducción. Thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. It is a delight to be in Santa Fe again and to be with all of you today in this festival that SARS has put together around the humanities. And maybe I should say something quick, but I think significant. The humanities are often pushed aside in favor of the sciences and businesses. They are the little sibling on campus, but without the humanities, not only on campus, without the humanities at the larger national and global level, we have no soul. We have no sense of self. It is because of Plato and because of Goethe and Garcia Marquez and Flaubert that we can figure out what are our contradictions, what are the doubts that push us forward or that hold us back. And the new Flaubert and the new Garcia Marquez and the new Goethe are right now writing, and they are hoping, just as their predecessors, to get readers, and it's readers ultimately that carry the torch of culture forward. I am going to be talking about the English language, this vast, plentiful river of sounds and of silences that brings us all here together. It is one of those lectures where it is not only what I'm going to say, but the fact that I'm going to say it in English that makes a statement. And for me in particular, it is a significant statement because English is not my first language. It's not the second and it's not the third, it's my fourth language. And it is the language after Spanish and Yiddish and Hebrew, which came to me as part of my education, as part of the environment that was growing up in a small Jewish enclave defined by immigrants of Eastern Europe that was so significant that the English language actually was a choice that I made, a choice to move to the United States and a choice to move probably more significantly into the English language fully and responsibly. I love this language. I find it so complex, a labyrinth, a kind of monster that appears to me every night, but also a mirror where many faces are reflected depending on the moment, depending on the circumstance. It is really not about English, but about American English that I want to be reflecting together with you. When the founding fathers, and I am now also an American citizens who were our founding fathers, were deciding to create a new nation, they had some of the ingredients they needed, and that is they had found or they had conquered, they had taken possession of territory, and they were dreaming of having a banking system and a post office and a national anthem and a flag. They were also immediately and automatically doing it in English. And nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Pledge of Allegiance, nowhere in the Federalist Papers is there really a question of should we do it, should we engage in the creation of this new nation that we are going to be founding, that it should be done in any other language but the language of the empire that had come with the pilgrims across the ocean, and that it disseminated across this vast and complex land, eventually to become the nation where we are today. Every language, every imperial language, every language that ultimately becomes the glue that brings a community together, and English is a sharp example, is also a cemetery of sounds of all the other languages that have perished along the way. And speaking about the American English, specifically in Santa Fe, this is a language that has erased the indigenous languages that were in many parts of this country, and just a few of the words of those indigenous languages, sometimes a cadence, sometimes a rhythm, sometimes a figure of speech, have become imprinted in the English language, in the American English language. But for the most part, it is really the ghost of those languages past that is reflected in the fact that very often when somebody delivers a lecture or a speech or a sermon, we today, and rightly so, acknowledge that this is a land that was taken from the Pueblo Indians or from the whatever, depending on the context. And yet, very few do so by reflecting on the fact that we are acknowledging those silences in the very language, not in the language of the Pueblo Indians or of the indigenous population of New York or of Connecticut or of Massachusetts, wherever it might be, but in the very language that erased that population. 325 million people in this country. You know, this concept of America as a large nation with a manifest destiny going from one coast to the other is a 19th century dream, the dream of expansionism, the dream of conquering it all and coming to the idea that we can be very different, very heterogeneous, very diverse, and still become a nation. But 325 million, do we all speak American English? What is it really that we speak when we speak to one another? Should we keep on calling it the English language, or at some point should we say this is no longer the English language, not even American English, but this is American, period. You know, when the French translate from the Spanish into French, they don't say traduit de l'espagnol, they say traduit de Mexican, translated from the Mexican or from the Chilean or from the Argentinian. Yet when somebody in English says, oh, I speak Mexican or I speak Chilean, we laugh at them. But there is a logic in saying that a particular nation has a particular way of using the English language or the Spanish language. There are 450 million people in Latin America. The dream of the Spanish conquest was precisely to take over not only with weapons and not only through a process of miscegenation and evangelization, but with the Spanish language. And so an Argentine and a Chilean and a Mexican and a Cuban can all talk to one another. there are differences in the language, and yet there's a lot that holds us together. And the same thing happens with American English. But to what extent is American English different from Australian English or Canadian English or British English or the English of New Zealand or the English of China? Because English is a very popular language in China. It's not official, but the Chinese want to learn the English language because they want to be part of the contemporary world. And in fact, English in its totality, is not the most popular language in the world. That is, it's not the language that is spoken the most. Is the language that is opted as a second language the most. Mandarin and Cantonese have many more speakers than the English language, but there are many more second language speakers of English than of any other language in the world. So the Chinese can learn the English language, and the Arabs and the whatever it might be, they are learning the English language. And think of this equation. For every 2 native speakers of English, there are three non-native speakers that are learning the language. The pressure on the native speakers is enormous. The fact that people from other cultures are learning the language and in a jazzy way, adapting to it in one way or another. How many of us have traveled to other parts of the world and there's a sign that supposedly is in English, but it's a bad translation of the English, and we all laugh, but there's an attempt behind it of honestly being able to convey in English what they think should be conveyed either for the tourists or for the natives. So the fact that we 325 million Americans speak all the English language, maybe that makes us all a part of this country that we call the United States. And yet, my friends, we all know that we are going through one of the most painful moments of reevaluation of what it means to be an American. There are very different views that are pushing our country in very different ways. They are represented by politics, the conservatives and the liberals, the Democrats and the Republicans, but that is only on the surface. We often say, particularly during the Trump years, that people could no longer sit at the Thanksgiving dinner table because there were others that were very different from them politically, and so they didn't have a common language. We no longer had a common way to talk to one another. What does that mean? We still spoke the English language, and yet it felt that we were not really with each other, our children or our spouses or our in-laws or whatever the relative might be. We had lost the sense of having a common language. Have we lost that sense? One of the driving questions that I ask myself today is, as the country becomes fractured, as we fight about what it means to be an American, is the English language, American English, or simply American, still what brings us all together? Or is that language also being fractured, being broken into pieces? We no longer really communicate with one another. Think of the way the Democrats use the language and the Republicans use the language. Talking about Latinos in particular, I don't hear Republicans ever use the word Latino. It is Hispanics. Hispanics are whatever they are going to say, whereas the Democrats will say Latino, but there's a lot of pressure among Democrats these days, so the word Latino no longer holds. It's Latino, Latina, Latinx. Nobody quite can pronounce the word Latinx, and yet it's the word that represents what the voices on the progressive side. It's the same group of about 65 million Americans, and yet they are described in one way by Governor DeSantis and in a very different way by Ocasio-Cortez from New York City. The very same group. And the same thing goes for the passionate, I would say maybe vitriolic approach to the word woke that Governor DeSantis has been using, regardless of whatever woke means or doesn't mean, it's just that word that creates this sense of anger, that something is rotten in the state of Massachusetts or in the state of New York, and it has to be fixed ASAP. I actually believe that the division or the divergence of what the Democrats and the Republicans or the conservatives and the liberals do with the English language is far less complicated and far less dangerous than what is really happening on social media, what is happening in media in general, in hip-hop music, in the realm of entertainment, and probably even more significantly, the very different ways that the immigrants in different groups use the English language, and the tension that the non-immigrants, the natives, have toward the immigrants, telling them, you should use the language in this way, or you should use it in that way. I'm going to return to that topic in 1 second. But before I do that, I want to ask you if you have a sense of how many words does the English language have in total. And does every standardized language, think French or Portuguese or Spanish or German, do all languages that are at that level, standardized and global, have the same number of words? When a poet that is writing now in Paris, in French, begins her draft, does she have at her disposal the same amount of words than a poet who's sitting down in Santa Fe and writing in the English language? Where the words come from? Who owns those words? How long does it take for a word that emerges in the outskirts, in the periphery of society, to become a standardized word, an accepted word? In what way do immigrants who came to this country and adopted and also adapted the English language own that language as much as the natives who have been in that language from birth? Is there a difference in terms of ownership, in terms of connection? So here are some thoughts. When in 1828, Noah Webster, our first lexicographer, published the American Dictionary of the English Language, our first really full-fledged dictionary, he was having in mind what Dr. Samuel Johnson had already done in the middle of the 18th century with a dictionary of the English language. To my mind, the best dictionary ever to be published. An attempt by a single Renaissance man in 1755 to put together all the words of the English language in a certain book. I still find this absolutely crazy, really crazy, and I love the way we use the word crazy these days. The fact that anybody could dream that every single word that we use can be imprisoned or can be corralled into a single book is in and of itself a quixotic dream. There is no complete dictionary. There is no unabridged dictionary. All dictionaries are abridged, and all dictionaries are limited, because the moment you publish a dictionary, there are already words that have already been left out that are struggling to get in. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, today has roughly 275,000 recorded words. I'm not saying here 275,000 words altogether. I'm saying words that are going to be defined. And according to the OED dons, or to the OED scholars, roughly about 150,000 are the words that people use on a regular basis. Now, I love the OED. You can get lost in the OED. Sometimes in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, I open the OED just to see words, what they mean, where they come from. But 170, 150,000 words, the average American does not use. My impression is, and this is kind of the running information among lexicographers, that the average American, and that is the American that any politician thanks at the very end of their speech, thank you, the American people, uses roughly maybe between 2,000 and 5,000 different words, 2,000 to 5,000 different words, vis-a-vis 150,000 words, according to the OED dunks. Regardless, I still don't even know if between 2,000 and 5,000 different words is really our vocabulary. Because in the end, I don't know, having lived in this country for almost 40 years, what's the average American? Who is the average American? Are we here representing the average American? Or is the average American about 40 years younger than me? Or about 10 years older than me? Is it somebody that looks Caucasian? Is it somebody that looks from an African background or from a mestizo background? Who is the average American? And an individual, a young person who uses the language on social media with words like frenemies and all these invented words that are circulating all the time, is that vocabulary also being included in the tally that the OED or that the lexicographers consider to be the language that the average American speaks? The fact is that the older we all become, the more conservative we tend to be throughout language, more protective. We tend to think that it is our duty to make this language that we received and that we're vessels of pass on to the next generation. And if we're not going to protect it, who is going to do that? Because the young people, no, the young people are always into neologisms, into new ways of speaking. And the young people tend to be far more liberal. When you ask lexicographers where the words come from, they will tell you that they come from many different places, but mostly they come from young people. They come from people that are inventing words because the world needs to have a new word to define an aspect that is now being recognized as new, and that newness needs to be reflected in the language that we speak. There are two types, there are many types, but really basically there are two types of dictionaries. The descriptive dictionaries, the ones that describe the language in a way that people ought to use. And the Académie Française loves to tell people how to use the French language. So does the La Real Academia Española, the Royal Academy of the Spanish language, in the Accademia della Crusca in Italy, the academy, and here I'm not talking about the universities, but the academies that are created to safeguard, protect, and perpetuate a language are the ones that are descriptive in their approach. They want people to use the language in the way that it should be used. There are other types of dictionaries. I'm switching here. The prescriptive dictionaries tell people how to use the language. The descriptive dictionaries are the dictionaries that reflect how the people on the streets are using the language and want to mirror that diversity in whatever way possible. The vast majority of dictionaries in the English language are descriptive dictionaries. And more so, we don't have in English the equivalent of a Royal Academy of the English language, like the French have, like the Spanish have, like the Italians have, I just mentioned. And to me, this is this is something really interesting. I think 98% of standardized languages have the equivalent of a federally funded or monarchy funded organization that is in charge of protecting the language. We don't. Nobody can tell us how to use a word. Nobody can tell us that a word used in this particular way is incorrect and that should not be used in that way and that we should use in another way. Actually, what I just said is not fully true. There's a teacher that will tell you that you're using the word in the wrong way. There's a parent that will tell you that you're using the word in the wrong way. There's a colleague or a friend who will tell you that's not the way you use the word. In fact, when I was little, I would use a particular word during the dinner table, and my father would say, Ilan, that's not the way to use the word, whatever. Go look it up in the dictionary. And I would become kind of mad. The dictionary to me was a kind of Bible, like gospel, that was arriving from above. And if it was recorded in the dictionary, then it meant that that word needed to be used in that particular way. In other words, there are no dictionaries that, if my father had it right, would have the wrong definition of a word, because all dictionaries were perfect and there were no mistakes in dictionaries. Actually, when Noah Webster created his dictionary, on the one hand, I should say, he was a rather adventurous plagiarist. About 30% of the words that Johnson had used already in his dictionary are reflected almost verbatim in the dictionary of Noah Webster. He also came forth with an entire new revolution. He suggested that in order to have a nation with our true language, we needed to have a spelling that was very different from the British. So no word like theater spelled with the ending, or any other word that, in his view, needed to be adapted to American English. And he also included many new words in the dictionary, such as skunk, that Johnson had never included in. Noah Webster is the first who ever thought that Americans need their own language. And he wanted to create a dictionary that would reflect the variety, the multiplicity of the American English language. He lived in New England, he hardly moved around the country, and he was a one-man show like Dr. Johnson. The majority of dictionaries today are done by committees. There's not a single individual. Every single definition has to go through a number of different transformations and mutations until it makes it in. I am very close to my friends at the Merriam-Webster offices in Springfield, Massachusetts. And Peter Sokolowski told me not too long ago that the word that made it the fastest in the history of Merriam-Webster, from the first moment that it was used to acceptance, was COVID-19. It was at the very end of January, maybe middle of January of 2020, when the word COVID-19 started circulating. We had just moved to that new year, and there was pressure on Merriam-Webster to recognize this word. And it took about 2 weeks and a half to 3 for that word to go from just being spontaneously used to being included in the online edition of the dictionary, and eventually on the printed edition. I find it incredibly significant and symbolic, the fact that it is also Merriam-Webster that about 2 years later, in 2022, its offices needed to be vacated after COVID because a man who believed that the lexicographers in that office were doing a damage to the English language by creating a new definition for the word day needed to be killed. He had come in with a rifle and was ready to start shooting people. Fortunately, everything was stopped and people had to leave the offices, and that person was arrested. And think of it, somebody would travel from Texas, it ended up being Texas, all the way to the offices of Springfield, Massachusetts, on the border with Connecticut, to take revenge against the dictionary makers for proposing a new way of using the word they, the noun and the gender fluidity in which we find ourselves, and thinking in some ways like my father, but maybe in a much more extreme fashion, that if the dictionary decides to redefine the word they, then it's going to be stated, a word forever. It is ultimately what those dictionaries say that becomes incredibly political. How a word is going to be defined. Who is the owner of that word? And for how long is that word going to be there before it is expelled? I said that there are descriptive dictionaries and prescriptive dictionaries. There are also historical dictionaries, dictionaries that don't expel words out, like the OED doesn't expel any word out. 275,000 are already there. And other dictionaries that decide that after a while, when a word is no longer used, there's no need to keep it. You can replace it with a new word because the memory that the dictionary represents is limited and contained. I was about maybe 3 months ago at the Skirball Center in LA in an event, a fabulous event with a number of high school students, very bright, sharp, very articulate. And it was about the future of the English language. And I asked them, you know, how they use social media, where if they invent new words, how long does it take for them to see a new word in a text message and realize what it means? Do they themselves create those new words? Do they have still a common language with their parents? Or do their parents feel completely alienated? Or they feel completely alienated from the parents? And I dared to ask them, toward the end of the conversation, if they thought that we still needed dictionaries. There were 8 kids on stage, and I can tell you with dismay that all of them said we don't need dictionaries. That the words are stable, the words are there forever, and that we will continue using them with a dictionary or without a dictionary. And that if we can't find it in the dictionary, a definition, we'll find it somewhere else. My reaction was that I was hoping that teachers would set in and tell them soon what a dictionary really does, that it is the gospel that comes from above, and that it tells you how words change, but that also one of the greatest fun activities could be to go and see how different dictionaries across time have defined a single word. Go and look for the word woman in dictionaries that started in the 1500s and the most present one. And you will see a whole transformation of society from Adam's rib, Adam's servant, a companion, a cook, to an independent, full-fledged citizen. Go and look for the word Jew in the Spanish dictionaries, and you will see in the dictionary of 1612 by Covarrubias that Jews are Christ killers and that everybody should be careful with them. Don't kill them, it says the dictionary, for they bear witness to our Lord Jesus Christ. And thus the past comes through them to the present. Obviously, the word Jew in the Spanish language has changed dramatically. But the fact is that dictionaries include all kinds of mistakes, all kinds of challenges, And in the Spanish language dictionary, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the author of 100 Years of Solitude, once bravely wrote to the Royal Academy, the Spanish dictionary is in the hands of the Royal Academy, and said that a day is not the time that it takes the sun to rotate around the earth. That if they had heard about Galileo, maybe they would be interested. And embarrassed, he made it very public, and embarrassed as they were, they inserted the word apparently. The time that it takes the sun to apparently rotate around the earth. Dictionaries are not only the memory of a culture, they are not only the DNA of who we are, they are in constant change. A definition that was there yesterday might change tomorrow because our language keeps on changing. If there's one stable element of language, is change. Change is always transforming the language. And the great beauty of the English language and of American English is the fact that it keeps on moving all the time. That the language of our founding fathers is totally different from the language that Emily Dickinson used, and the language that Mark Twain used, and Hemingway, and Fitzgerald, and Willa Cather, and the language that we are using today. It's the same American English, it's a very different American English. And if sometimes the British have imagined Shakespeare coming back and engaging in London with somebody, contemporaries of ours, remember the Bible, the entirety of the Bible, has only a lexicon of 8,000 different words. The entirety of the plays by Shakespeare, 16,000 words. Shakespeare introduced a number of different words into the English language, lawyer among them, among others. But he only had as his lexicon in his written form 16,000. So if we have 275,000 words in the OED, that is that between the death of Shakespeare in 1616 and today, we have added many, many more words. And that every generation has more words than the generation that came before. And even though we can't really spend that much time knowing all these words, the fact is we have them at our disposal. And the words will change. When I came to this country, the word bad meant bad. Thanks to Michael Jackson, to my kids, to my students, the word bad now can be a beautiful statement of affirmation. That's bad, meaning that's terrific. It's the same word, but it has been co-opted and adopted and transformed by the new generation. I want to just finish with, as Michael said, Spanglish. And I say this in Santa Fe, one of the cradles of Spanglish. When I first came to this country with maybe a vocabulary of, 500 English language words, totally intimidated, telling everybody in my very limited English that I would never catch on, that I would never catch up, that I would never be like everybody else because I had not been born into this incredible language, that I realized that the language on the subway in New York was not the English language that I was hoping to adapt and adopt. It was something altogether different. It had Russian, and it had Yiddish, it had Italian, it had Gaelic, and it had a lot of Puerto Rican and Cuban and Mexican and Dominican. And a single sentence would go back and forth between el español and then English and the regreso, back, de ida and back again. And there was a sense of inventiveness and exquisiteness in that going back and forth. So if a native English speaker speaks between 2,000 and 5,000 words, a bilingual person maybe speaks about 8,000 words. I don't know. I don't really count them. But I do know that if you have another language, you must have another vocabulary, although it's hard to keep up the two vocabularies. And what happens with a hybrid language like Spanglish is that it steals, it borrows from one, and it steals and it borrows from the other shamelessly, and creates something that is kind of an in-between. It's what I called the marriage and the divorce of two standardized languages, but also two civilizations in ways of seeing and of thinking. I have the impression that we are witnessing the emergence of an entirely new civilization in the United States with Spanglish. There are, as I mentioned, 65 million Latinos. Believe me, many Latinos are fluent in Spanish and English and Spanglish, but they can be only monolingual, Spanglish or Spanish or English. But there are many non-Latinos that use a lot of Spanglish. And the question is, can a language that is not standardized in terms of grammar, syntax, and morphology ever achieve the same kind of equilibrium than an imperial language like French, like English, like Spanish? And my answer is just travel back 500 years ago, and you will see that in Spain there was something called Spanish that was stealing from the language of Castile and was also stealing from Vulgar Latin, one of the languages of the fractured Roman Empire, and eventually that coalesced into the language that we call Spanish today. In other words, it's like an astronomer looking at a new galaxy, now with the Webb telescope. You are seeing not only the birth of a new universe, you are also capable of seeing how your own universe was created. And the fact is that the words that were coming from Latin and were coming from Castilian were coalescing into something new, so that in 1492, three major events happened. One is that the Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, that there was a reconquista of Spain, and also that Columbus, sailed the ocean blue and did the disasters that he did on the other side. But there was a fourth event that happened exactly that year, and that is that the first dictionary of the Spanish language was produced by Antonio de Nebrija, La Gramática de la Lengua Española. In that gramática, the word boat is barco, un barco. The second edition, 1496, Nebrija takes the word boat out and replaces it with the word canoa, canoe. The first American word ever to travel back from this part of the globe there, and from this part of language to that part of language. And think what immigrants have done to American English. How many words of Italian are now in American English? How many Yiddish words like chutzpah and bagel and schmuck and many others? How many words from Russian and Swedish and French? The English language in America has been nurtured by conquest, by imperial drives, by the destruction of the Aboriginal languages, and by the flux, unending, of immigrants who not only come to work to dream a better dream, but to change the language as well. And now, I think how many? 500,000? I don't know if I have the number right. Venezuelans are going to have the capacity to work legally in New York. It's a huge, huge statement. 500,000 Venezuelans are now going to be officially workers speaking the Spanish language and learning the English language in New York City. Believe me, in 5 years, Spanish and English in New York will be dramatically different. 500,000 people speaking because they need to survive and the rest of New York embracing them as they should and as they did the previous immigrants. I don't know where Spanglish is going to go. I do know that it already has a dictionary. And once you have a dictionary, you have a sense of standing. I also know that some of us have begun translating the masterpieces of the past into Spanglish. I translated Don Quixote into Spanglish, and I got so many death threats, I can't tell you. The Little Prince has been translated into Spanglish, and Romeo and Juliet, and Alice in Wonderland. If you start translating into a language, that means that the language is not only the speakers of the present, but the speakers of other cultures that are arriving into it. And Spanglish is having that, just as we in American English have 22 translations of Don Quixote from which we can choose. 22 translations of Don Quixote. We have more Don Quixotes in English than in Spanish. We only have one, the sacred one, the Don Quixote. But here you can choose. So let me wrap all this by saying that it is true we live at a moment of intense anxiety, a moment in which we are looking deeply, thoroughly at what it means to be an American. I frankly don't believe at any point in our history we have not looked frankly and directly of what it means to be an American. It's just that now, because of media, because of the exposure that we have to everything that is happening 24 hours, we hear it more. It feels more direct, more in the flesh. At the same time, there is really a referendum. Is America white? Is America of different colors? Does America speak only one language, or does America speak many different languages? The founding fathers did not put English as an official language. Some states have chosen English as an official language, but there's no official language in the Constitution. That means that you can live in many different languages, and many of us know many people who speak different languages and have lived in this country with different languages. Believe me, speaking a second language or a third language or a fourth language allows you to see the universe in a second or third or fourth way. This is a country that is allergic to translation. It's allergic to foreign language, and yet it is a country of immigrants all the time, immigrants that are arriving and dreaming. I ask my students, and I will conclude here, when the immigrants used to come and the Statue of Liberty would greet them, in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty was a sonnet, arguably the most famous sonnet of American English, written by Emma Lazarus, the New Colossus. Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. All those Italians, all those Irish, all those Jews who came through Ellis Island and saw Lady Liberty, when eventually arriving to see the pedestal, they did not see a translation of the New Colossus into Yiddish or Italian or Gaelic or any other language. That is the language that spoke to them or didn't speak to them. Today, with bilingual education, with the sense that the country is much more open to other languages, we say learn English, but don't lose your language, your original language. Keep it, expand it. We're much more global. The country is at a crossroads. The language that we have is what is bringing us together. It is a language without an academy to tell us how to speak it. It is a truly democratic language. It is the people who choose how to speak it. And if we all decide that this is not going to be a ceiling, but it's going to be a rf, and everybody starts using rf to describe this, then the word rf is going to make it to Merriam-Webster. And that is the way things go. Merriam-Webster doesn't tell us how to speak the language. We tell the Merriam-Webster folks how to speak the language. And if a new immigrant comes in with a better word than rf that we all like, we might just go to that one. That will be the one that will define us. And the definition of Americans is the definition of how the language will keep changing. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. I want to start with a question of my own. The vocabulary issues you talk about are really important, and I'm persuaded. But language also embodies rules of comportment. And I'll tell you a story, and that will be familiar to you. In my last year, well, one of my last years of teaching at Williams, was I had a first-year student, because at Williams you can't call them freshmen because it's man at the end. So they're first-year students. I don't know, they didn't do away with sophomores, despite the association with sophomoric. But anyway, so this first-year student sent me an email about something in a class, and it started off, "Yo, Mike." Now, you know, I didn't expect my student to say, "Herr Dr. Professor Brown," but "Yo, Mike" was a little over the top. And even for me, and I'm fairly relaxed about that kind of stuff.
Did you write back?
Well, I'm trying to remember how I responded. I didn't say, "I'm not Yo Mike to you. I'm not Yo Mike to anybody." But I think I did feel that it was really important. This is obviously a student who didn't understand rules of respect, I guess we could say, or even hierarchy. I could live with that. I'd like to think I was grading him. And so I wondered what you thought about the fact that some, is Spanish ready to do away with usted versus tú, for example, in the interest of democratizing the Spanish language, because so much of American English has done away with official titles and titles that are expressive of power relations.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Michael, I have become very aware of that, just like you. When I tried to learn the language formally, and one of my first efforts was to try to read. I had read Moby Dick in Spanish before coming to the United States, and I got myself a Penguin Classics copy of the Melville book, and I would, knowing what it was about, I would read it just to see the words, and then close it, write down the words, go to the dictionary, try to see what the words meant, and then open the book again to see if there had been an impact on that. What I realized is that I wasn't reading Moby Dick. I was reading the dictionary, thanks to Moby Dick. One of the formal parts was to start using "dear such and such," "dear Michael" or "dear Professor," for a long time I kept on using it, but my students were quickly switching to "Hi, Professor," H-I. And all my colleagues started using "hi." I can't quite use "hi" myself. Hi, and so I just simply put the name, Michael, how are you? Get rid of anything that comes before. I think that if that student had written to me, I would have used the same word to refer to him, and I would have invited him to a beer and try to understand more other parts of his speech, but I can see the tension.
But I mean, the issue is partly your role as a professor is prescriptive, right?
Right.
It's not descriptive, and so if you meet young people who clearly haven't, are going to go out into the world and get a job, for example, Yo Steve isn't going to work at a job interview, right? I presume.
I am not fully sure that my role as a professor is prescriptive. It is also prescriptive, but might be more descriptive than prescriptive. And I think that language belongs to those who use it. And if people consistently start using the "yo" much more, my son, Josh, uses "yo" all the time. He speaks a language very different from mine. And I can tell you that it took a long process of parenting from my end, it's self-definition, to realize that there wasn't a defiant approach in him because of the language that he was using, but I was reading that defiance in the language, and that I needed to teach myself not to see that, to see the real Josh. So it's You know, I think that the role of the professor has changed so much. My students call me profe, and I like it more.
I could live with profe too. How about some questions here?
Like that.
Yes, Frank.
Is there any theater in Spanglish? Is that happening now? Are plays being written and produced?
Yes. There's theater in Spanglish. There are movies in Spanglish. There's beautiful poetry in Spanglish. There is astonishing music coming out in Spanglish. There are sermons in Spanglish, political speeches in Spanglish. Soon, there are novels in Spanglish. And soon, for a Spanglish novel to be understood in Madrid, it will need to be translated into Spanish. Because it's no longer the case that a Spanglish text can be understood by either an English speaker or a Spanish speaker. It has its own metabolism, its own idiosyncrasy, which is beautiful. I should say, every immigrant group in the United States has had what you and I could describe as a middle step language. Yinglish. Not Yiddish and not English, but Yinglish. It was the language of the children of the immigrants before they acquired fully the English language. And there is something in Chinglish and in Japanese, etc. But because of the numbers in terms of Latinos, because of the closeness of the place once called home, or still called home, because of globalism, Spanglish is not a middle step. Spanglish is an end in and of itself. And I teach a course in Spanglish and on Spanglish, and the students later on, having graduated, write back saying that they're so thankful because they got the job at Univision using the Spanglish. And bring it back, at the beginning when I started teaching Spanglish, 1999, the first class, the BBC was outside, NPR, the New York Times, and I got called by the president. Ilan, can you come to my office after all this news that have emerged? And he told me that there had been a funder, who had declined giving money to Amherst because Amherst was now teaching Spanglish. And he said, good for you. Go on. I think that the classroom is a place for language not as it is, but as it is being shaped. And if it's not done in the classroom, I don't know where. The classroom is the lab where we can hear the other voices, where the students are coming from, and how the language is changing, and give legitimacy to that. So I think, Michael, that we teach them how to use the English language, but we also are taught by them how the English language is used, and there's a give and take between the two.
How about over on this side in the back there? Mary's going through her paces to get the microphone over there.
Excuse me. There you go.
Well, thank you, Ilan, paisano.
Un placer.
I believe that the English language and the English speaking countries are, first world countries because of the language. The language is so vast. I heard it was 1 million words in English. If you count all the technology on the internet and all those that are strictly in English, I didn't know that there was no academy here in the United States. I just learned that.
Can you imagine Trump telling us, anybody in Washington telling us how to use the English language? It's too individualistic a country for having something like that.
Yeah, and the thing is, I was appalled because, COVID-19 in 3 weeks make it to the dictionary. That's an insult.
Should have been in one?
Eh?
You should have been faster, you mean?
In Spanish, the word taco taco in the Spanish language in the dictionary, it has like 20 different acepciones. Taco as a tortilla with meat and that you eat wasn't in the Spanish language until a few years ago.
Yeah,
It took all these years.
it's terrible. I mean, just the word Spanglish. The word Spanglish wasn't in the Spanish dictionary until about 6 years ago, after many of us were saying, hello, there are millions of people speak. You have the word French, Français. You don't have the word Spanish. They put it in, and the first definition that they had was the language that Latinos misuse when mixing Spanish and English. They are telling us how to misuse the language. Come on. I mean, it's in Madrid, they're going to decide how we speak the language. That's the last thing we want to hear.
So the thing is, English gets words from all other, is quick to adjust, is quick to use them. In Spanish, it takes forever for one word to get into the dictionary, and that's
It's true. It's true.
bad. Thank you,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Yes, ma'am.
Here you go.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wanting to go back to the yo professor.
Yeah.
I once heard an African American teenager say to an African American bus driver, "Yo, what?" And the driver said, "My name ain't Yo." So there's contesting. I think the question of code switching. I'm a child of immigrants, and I'm an immigrant. That I felt it was my duty as a college teacher to make it clear to students. There's a formal written language. There's a way you talk to someone in a job interview. There's a way you talk to your friends. It's a choice. And I think you're talking a lot about
Absolutely.
individual choices, but to make those knowledgeably and to get a job, obviously to your advantage.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think our role as educators, our role as parents, we're not born with a manual on how to parent, and we learned how to be teachers only after a while, is to establish this. Look, this is the way the English language is. It's yours too, students. It's yours. You can do with it what you want, and you will, just as we did, but it is important that you know what's the proper grammar, the proper syntax. It's your choice to break it the way Zora Neale Hurston broke it, the way Junot Diaz breaks it. Break it, but you don't get to be a Picasso if you don't learn to how the whole process of drawing art realistically. And that is what I tell my students. Just understand the language. Once you understand it, be as free as you want with it. And spread that gospel of freedom. Because English, as our friend was saying, is incredibly free. The fact that we all can decide how to use it gives us a lot of power. It's also dangerous because we can drive the language to the ground. And the very first, the founding fathers, John Adams, has a letter where he says, if we don't create an academy the way the French has it, the language will go to the dogs. And there are repeated attempts at the end of the 18th century, first half of the 19th century, in Washington to figure out, should we create such an academy? Otherwise, the dogs, and the dogs, what do the dogs mean here? Immigrants, or the illiterate, or women, or children. At that time, that is the conception. In the end, they could not act. They couldn't put their act together in that. And the result is that nobody will say, except for us. We are the authority, and we're also the subversive forces in that language. And I think in that sense, it's incredible to be a teacher. You pass on the gospel, but you have to be hearing how they speak the language too. And that is so revitalizing.
Got a lot of hands up here. You, sir.
I teach high school students, and it seems like every year, if not every semester, they're coming in with some verbiage that I'm like, what does that mean? Yep. So I've resorted to using the Urban Dictionary, and I'm wondering, is that something you do, or is it a valid?
It's something you do and I do. The Urban Dictionary is the most democratic dictionary. Everybody uses it. It's like Wikipedia, but much more open. I use the Urban Dictionary sometimes just to laugh, and sometimes to see what's the temperature of the culture. How is it being used? You know, today, those 8 high schoolers were not wrong. Dictionaries as books are losing ground dramatically. Merriam-Webster doesn't sell the number of copies this year that it sold last year. People are not buying hardcover dictionaries. People are doing online dictionaries. And the effect of online dictionaries, I have the best students in the universe in the college where I teach. And yet, I tell you in a shocking way, my students don't know how to alphabetize. They don't know what we do in a dictionary of where the L goes or where the X goes, because they don't use a dictionary. They put the X on the search and it goes to wherever. So that idea of using your finger to figure out in the dictionary is of the Neanderthals. It's of another period. So I think the online dictionaries are the ones that are much more fluid. That's why a word can travel so fast. An Urban Dictionary is an incredibly inventive, I don't know how serious we can take it, but it's delicious in its capacity to invent.
That's what I wanted. I just wonder how valid.
Sure.
Speaking of which, maybe some of you read Jill Lepore's article in the New Yorker about how her Harvard students can no longer read cursive handwriting. I mean, that makes you feel
Yeah.
ancient. You know, it's like paleography, you know, to read handwriting. Wow. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. When Esperanto was invented in the 40s as hopefully the universal language, and then it kind of fizzled out, do you think, since the world is getting so much smaller, a language like that could eventually happen, or has English kind of become that?
Oh, great. Thank you very much for that question. I hope everybody heard it. It's the question about connected with Esperanto, the universal language created by Zamenhof in the second part of the 19th century. The core of the question to me is the difference between a universal language and particular languages. We live in the myth of the Tower of Babel is probably the most hands-on aspect. Everybody goes up in one way, everybody comes down with a punishment, as I read it, that now they have to speak many different languages because of the hubris that they had of attempting against God. But you know, the question, if we all spoke one single language, would there be no war? Would there be no divorces, no disagreements, no evil? And the truth is, I don't think anybody wants a universal language, because the beauty of the world is in the difference, is in the nuances that we have. Now, Zamenhof was incredibly bright. He did not want a universal language that everybody could speak as a first language. He wanted a universal language that everybody could speak as a second language. So you can speak English and Esperanto and Russian and Esperanto and Swahili and Esperanto. And that is still the dream of the Esperantistas. It was the dream of the Yiddish speakers, and Zamenhof was a Yiddish speaker, that a Jew from Lithuania and a Jew from Galicia and a Jew from Warsaw could all communicate with one another with this neutral tongue. Maybe English has become the universal second language that I was talking at the very beginning. In being so, English is very destructive. English, by forcing itself on other people, that makes also the nuances of those languages, or the fact that they would know more words in their original language, more difficult to sustain. Anybody who speaks a second language will tell you they are very proud. They will also tell you, at least this person will tell you, I don't know anymore all the vocabulary for the fish in Spanish. I've lived in this country so long, I know how to say different types of fish in English, different flowers, but I don't know the original names of the flowers anymore, and I have to look them up in my first language. The same thing with fish and others. So memory recedes, and you can only control certain words. I believe that English is actually a language that is losing ground rather than perpetuating itself. I do believe that Chinese is spreading its wings in a dramatic way, and all languages like Latin and French and Spanish had an imperial period of ascent and then have a period of descent. Could English fracture the way Latin fractured in creating the Romance languages? Unlikely. The English in Australia and the English in the UK and the English here will not become dialects. But we are at a time where other languages are competing for global dominance. And it might be that, just in 50 years or in 250 years, not only many of the words that we're using right now will no longer be understood, but that language might be challenged by others. It's possible. The way English challenged other languages, let us not be foolish to think that because English has the power now, we'll have it in perpetuity. That resists the idea of change, and change is what makes language and the universe what they are. Thank you very much. You want another one?
Yo, I guess I should.
Yo, right here.
Yo, bro.
Yo, professors. First, just want to thank you, Professor, because I took a course with you through JTS in the January
Oh.
and online. And anyone who has the opportunity, it was wonderful.
Oh,
You know,
I appreciate it.
early Spanish novels, et cetera. It was great. Second, time is moving so quickly. Society is changing so quickly. I mean, you speak of the 500,000 Venezuelans who can now work. It was big news when Germany took a million Afghans and Syrians. I mean, this is just radical change. Maybe of lesser note was the U.S. Senate changing its dress code.
Right.
So Senator Fetterman can come in his hoodie and his shorts.
He was already doing it, and it's because he was arriving this way, probably, that this was prompted.
And because the party that probably most of us appreciate knows where the votes are, and the conservative, traditional, what Amherst was in the 50s is not the Amherst of today.
I don't like ties,
And,
as you can see.
I was there in the 70s. They had on the plates, shocking, they had on the plates Lord Jeffrey Amherst murdering, assaulting
Yeah.
Native Americans on the plates,
It's
and
not
those
impossible that in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, the town of Amherst will not be called Amherst.
There's a lot of this that, and Mount Rushmore will have different people on it,
Yeah.
preferably.
Yeah.
And
Maybe some women.
the radical music of the 60s that was so disturbing to society, you hear in elevators and in Trader Joe's, and it's like,
Right.
and on car commercials, whatever. Because I was at that college 50 years ago or so, I remember a professor writing on my paper, and it's interesting what we remember decades later. I used the word ultimately. And he wrote on the side, never ever use the word ultimately again. Ultimately, we're all dead. Now, my question is that prescription, was he appropriate at that time, or is it still appropriate today to protect a word with its original meaning when ultimately, someone will win the, ultimately we'll go home and have dinner.
Yeah.
So I just wonder is your sense of how we protect these words, and was that overstated?
As a good professor, he overstated. Protect any word. Choose one word. Choose 10 words and protect them. And that protection will take us somewhere, maybe not very far, but words need protection. It's good for young people to hear this word matters. It matters to me. Don't use it this way. If they don't want to pay attention to us, the very least they'll do what happened to you. You'll remember that, professor, and the word ultimately will not pass by in your lexicon easily. So I think that any teacher, any parent, any adult that can tell to a younger person, this word matters to me, has already created a bond with that individual through that word. And what else is human but that? Just that connection with a word. They will remember it and they will laugh, or they, many years later, will come back to that word and say, I think maybe they were right and I rebelled. Rebellion and consent is what keeps us moving. I needed to tell my father, no, dictionaries are not what you're thinking. And now I understand him very well, and I'm glad that he told me that dictionaries matter so much. I would not love and have an entire collection of dictionaries if somebody had not called my attention to them in that way. And it might be that dictionaries become an artifact of the past, that we will have to go to the Smithsonian to see the Merriam-Webster edition of 2023. That in and of itself will be a wonderful journey for somebody to see that object in a museum. Words matter no matter where you have them. They need protection, and they also need rebels to resist them. Thank you very much. Thank you.